Last light on the Teton. The first thing I noticed about Piers Callahan was that he was lying flat on his stomach in a snowfield at 11,000 feet, completely still, watching his drone controller like it was the only thing that mattered in the world. Which, at that exact moment, it was. I'd been running upslope for 6 minutes through ankle-deep early snow when I spotted the orange shell jacket against the white. My patient, Marcus Webb, was GPS tagged another 240 meters up the slope. I had maybe 18 minutes before the weather window collapsed entirely. I did not have time to stop. I stopped. "You the one on the radio?" I called. Wind was cutting hard at 25 knots from the northwest, the leading edge of a front that had moved the forecast window up by 3 hours and turned a manageable autumn rescue into something considerably more interesting. He didn't look up from the controller screen. "Callahan, yes. Battery at 18%. You have approximately 11 minutes. That was it. No panic. No preamble. 11 minutes, stated the way you'd read a weather observation. I came in fast and crouched beside him. The drone monitor showed me something I needed to see immediately. Our standard LZ on the upper saddle was a solid white wall of cloud and driven snow. Not recoverable, but there was a shelf, 30 meters wide, rocky, exposed but stable, just east of the false summit. Clear air above it, wind angle workable, enough flat surface for the Bell 429 if the pilot came in from the northeast at a low approach angle. "That shelf holds?" I asked. "I've been up here since 0600, 6 hours of wind data." He finally looked up at me. Green eyes, the kind of sharp, clear green that looks like it belongs at sea level and has no business being this far up a mountain. Jaw set against the cold. Snow on his collar and in his dark auburn hair. 22 years old at most, and completely composed. Consistent easterly at 12 knots, gusting to 16. The approach corridor stays open if your pilot stays below the ridgeline on a northeast bearing. "You know rotor approach angles." "My father worked HAA contracts." He said it like a fact, not an explanation. "You want me to mark the corridor with the drone?" "Yes. Maintain position on it while I go get my patient. Can you do that on 18%? A brief calculation moved behind his eyes. "Yes, but it's close. Your pilot needs to be ready to move on my call." "He will be." I keyed my radio. "Echo base Nakano. Viable LZ on the shelf east of False Summit. Northeast approach below ridgeline, bearing 270. Civilian drone operator on site providing real-time corridor guidance. Patch me to flight direct." "Copy, Nakano. Flight is 2 minutes from approach. Weather window closing. You've got 20 minutes max." 20 minutes, 240 meters upslope. Patient stabilization, helicopter loading, clear sky. All on a battery under 18%. Or so it had to be. I looked at Piers Callahan. "Your name is in my incident report." I'd expect that. He was already adjusting the drone's position, placing it precisely in the middle of the approach corridor like a marker buoy. I ran. Those green eyes wouldn't leave my mind. 20 minutes. I have to make it. There is no other choice. 20 minutes. Vivid green. 20 minutes. Marcus Webb was a 43-year-old from Salt Lake City attempting a solo climb on the Grand Southern Approach. Tib-fib fracture from a fall on the rocky section at 11,200 feet. Self-splinted with trekking poles lashed together with webbing. Better field medicine than I expected from a recreational climber on his own. His lips were faintly blue. Pulse ox read 87%. Core temp had been dropping for at least 90 minutes in the wind chill, and I didn't like his color. I got the hypothermia wrap around him, elevated his legs on my pack, started a chemical heat pack under the insulation layer. "Am I going to be okay?" he asked. "You're going to be better than okay," I told him. "You're going to have a great story." My radio. "Nakano, this is flight. I've got a drone marker visual. Am I clear for approach?" I keyed Piers's channel. "Callahan, corridor status." 3 seconds. Long enough that I felt every one of them. Clear. Wind stable. Battery at 9%. He's good, but keep descent rate below 300 feet per minute. Rotor wash risk off the eastern face on anything faster. I hadn't asked him to monitor rotor wash risk. He'd been monitoring it on his own. I relayed the descent restriction to the pilot. He acknowledged without question. Any mountain pilot worth trusting knows to take the eyes on the ground call seriously. The Bell 429 appeared through the cloud layer 30 seconds later, following the corridor exactly, dropping at a measured rate that told me the pilot had taken the instructions seriously. It came in below the ridgeline, cut east at the shelf, and touched down so smoothly I could hear the exact moment the skids made contact. 4 minutes later, Marcus Webb was at the helicopter. My partner Yeva had the door open before I reached the skids, assessed my packaging with one look and said, "Good rap," in the particular tone she reserves for things that actually impressed her. We had him loaded in 90 seconds flat. "Nakano, riding out?" the pilot asked. I looked back up the slope. Piers Callahan had the drone on final descent, a controlled landing through 25-knot crosswind, placing it into the case with a precision that would have made a professional drone pilot pay attention. "Negative," I said. "I have a civilian to account for. Send ground extract in 40 minutes. I heard Yeva's silence through the window. Yeva's silences said everything. The helicopter lifted, banked northeast through the corridor, and disappeared into the only clean sky left over the Tetons. I walked back up the slope toward the man in the orange jacket. He had the drone packed and was standing when I reached him, organized, ready to move, not waiting to be told what happened next. That, I was starting to understand, was simply how Piers Callahan operated in a field situation. "Ground extract in 40 minutes, I said, "but the window collapsed early. We may need to shelter." He looked at the sky with the same complete attention he gave everything else, unhurried, absorbing multiple data points at once. The storm wall was moving fast from the north now. Wind had climbed from 25 knots to 30 in the time I'd been with Marcus. "I know a place. Rock outcrop, 300 meters east. I scouted it this morning before the birds came in." He adjusted his pack straps. "It's rated for a full front. I've bivouacked through worse in it." I fell into step beside him. He moved well in the terrain, weight forward, knees soft, the mountain gait of someone with real hours on technical ground. For a wildlife filmmaker, he walked like a backcountry guide. "Clark's Nutcrackers brought you up today," I said. He slid a look at me sideways. Quick, assessing. "Most SAR personnel don't know the species by sight. I've been pulling people off this mountain for 4 seasons. I need to understand what it's doing to do my job well." The wind was strengthening. I raised my voice slightly against it. "The whitebark pines are stressed. Blister rust, warming temperatures. The nutcrackers' winter food cache degrades every season they move higher. The snowpack follows the canopy. 2 years ago, we had 3 separate incidents on routes that used to be stable, and every single one of them traced back to changed snow conditions on terrain the pine roots used to anchor. To understand why the snow shifts, I have to understand the ecosystem driving it." He stopped walking, a full deliberate stop in the middle of a whiteout approach, as if this was worth pausing the urgent situation to address. "You know the nutrient cycle," he said. "Enough of it to understand why what you're documenting matters." I kept moving. He caught up immediately. "Also, a good portion of our October rescues tie directly to weather window miscalculations, and those are increasingly connected to accelerated climate shifts in the subalpine zone. Your research area and my rescue area are the same area." He was brief for a moment. Then, "I've been explaining why this documentary matters to people for 2 years. Usually I lose them somewhere around seed dispersal." "Apparently I'm not one of them," I said. "No," he said, "you really aren't." He looked closely with his vibrant green eyes. He looked as if he was about to say something, but stopped himself. The outcrop was everything he described. 2 angled granite faces forming a natural wind pocket, 3 meters deep, floor space enough for 2 people without crowding. The wind velocity dropped from 30 knots to near 0 the moment we stepped inside. It was the difference between a crisis and a campsite. Piers set his pack down and moved immediately. Ordered, efficient, nothing wasted. Emergency bivy unrolled against the inner face. Then the thermos. Opened it. Steam rose. He held it out without saying anything. Coffee. Strong, black, the field-grade kind that gets serious about its job. I took it, drank, handed it back. He drank from the same side without thinking about it. Neither of us mentioned it. The valley was still visible below. Jackson Hole in the late morning light, the flat silver mirror of the reservoir, the grid of the town, the October cottonwoods yellow along the Snake River. Then the storm wall erased all of it, and there was only white and granite and the two of us. "Your pilot," I said, "when he came in, the rotor wash call, you stated it with authority, not as a suggestion. He would have questioned it if you'd framed it differently. The eastern face creates a pressure differential at certain approach angles. It's predictable physics." He turned the thermos in his hands, a pause that meant he was deciding something. "My father was the best helicopter mechanic I've ever watched work. HAA contract out of Portland before that military. He could diagnose a problem by sound before he opened an access panel." The thermos rotated slowly between his palms. "When I was 12, he used to let me sit in the hangar while he worked. He'd narrate everything, not teaching, just thinking out loud. I absorbed it the way you absorb things when you're young and someone you love is explaining the world to you." He paused. Outside, the wind hit 40 knots. The granite above us picked up a low harmonic resonance, the mountain testing its own structure. "He died when I was 16. Hydraulic failure on a maintenance check. The kind of thing that statistically almost never happens, which doesn't mean anything at all when it does." I didn't say I'm sorry. He'd heard that thousands of times and it had stopped meaning anything a long time ago. What I said was, "Did he know about the film work?" "He knew I loved the mountains. He used to fly me over the Cascades on repositioning flights sometimes. Not official. His kid in the co-pilot seat with a headset on. Too young to understand what I was looking at." A long pause. "I think he would have understood why I do it. He loved things that worked properly, completely, with all their components dependent on each other. He would have respected the ecology of it." "The Cascade," I said. "Yeah, the Cascade." The wind outside was serious now. Snow came in horizontal, the dry, crystalline kind that gets into everything, hissing against the granite above us in long, wave-like intervals. But in here, the air barely moved. "Your family?" he asked. "My mother is Japanese-American, third generation from Gardena, California. My father is Eritrean-American, first generation, grew up in Denver. Both of them are people who make wherever they are better than they found it. My mother volunteers at a community garden. My father is a structural engineer who specifically takes projects in under-resourced neighborhoods." I stretched my legs across the bivy. "I tried college, pre-med first year. I was good at it. But I sat in a lecture hall for 3 months feeling like I was in the wrong dimension. I needed something real, immediate, where the outcome depended on what I did in the next 10 minutes. And the mountain does that. Every time." I looked out at the white wall. "There are also names. The extractions that don't go well, you keep those." He didn't rush past that. He held it, the way you hold something that deserves to be held. "The footage that isn't good enough to make someone care," he said after a moment. "That's mine. Not technical failure. Whether a person who didn't already care about the white bark pine watches it and starts caring, because if they don't, the archive just documents a loss. It doesn't prevent one." Outside, the wind cycled through another peak. A creek somewhere on the upper face. Snow compressing, adjusting, the mountain doing its work. "You okay?" he said. It was a quiet question, level, the kind you ask when you're actually asking, not filling silence with sound. I looked at him. The storm had put color into his face, high along his cheekbones, the bridge of his nose. His eyes were very green in the flat blizzard light. "I keep being," I said. Something in him settled. The specific quality of someone who has heard a true answer and recognized it. "Me too," he said. At its peak, the storm was extraordinary. Visibility outside dropped to maybe 4 meters. The snow came in waves, each gust adding white to white until the world outside the outcrop was pure abstraction. Piers had his camera out, not the drone, a small mirrorless body, and he was shooting through the opening, long exposures, 30 seconds, 45, the driven snow turning to lines of silver force against the dark granite frame. He held completely still for the long exposures. Breathing shallow, body a mounting platform, the same quality of stillness I'd first seen on the snowfield, Not suppression, not waiting. Genuine presence, fully directed. Tell me the actual thesis, I said. Not the pitch. He lowered the camera, considered. The Clark's nutcracker caches 10 times more seeds than it needs for winter. The excess, the seeds it never recovers, becomes new white bark pines. The overflow of the bird's own survival strategy is how the forest moves upslope as the climate shifts. He tilted the camera screen toward me. The long exposure had turned the storm into something abstract and beautiful. Silver lines, dark rock, the geometry of wind made visible. The animals that survive the cascade aren't the ones who adapt perfectly. They're the ones who do more than they need to, who commit beyond the minimum. He looked at me. The documentary is called The Cache. That's the right title. Jackson Hole Wildlife Film Festival. Main slate. He said it quietly, the way you say a thing you've been protecting for a long time. I found out last month. I was alone in my tent at the research station, and I read the email twice, and then I went outside and stood there for about 10 minutes. And then I went back in and kept editing, because the deadline was still the deadline. He set the camera down on his bag. There wasn't anyone to tell. I understood that. The specific solitude of a significant thing happening to you in a field, with nowhere to direct it. There will be, I said. He looked at me sideways. Something in his expression ran a calculation I couldn't see the inputs to. Then it completed, are you seeing anyone? The question came out clean, no performance, no preamble. The mountain stripped that kind of padding away. He blinked, a genuine, unguarded blink of surprise. Then whatever was calculating in his expression finished. No, he said. You? No. The wind was at its highest. Snow was everywhere. We were strangers by every technical measure. Two people on a mountain in a blizzard who had met 90 minutes ago under exceptional circumstances. Okay, he said. Okay, I said. We sat with that for a while and it felt right. Not rushing it. Not pretending the admission hadn't changed the air between us. Not filling it with noise. The mountain was loud enough. The front moved through faster than the updated forecast. By 3:15, the wind had dropped from 40 knots to 20. By 3:30, the southern sky had cracked open, gray-blue, enormous. The specific quality of clarity that only comes after a significant system has pushed completely through. Piers looked at the sky without checking his watch. 40 minutes, maybe 35. That's what I said too. He glanced at me with something like satisfaction. Reading the mountain. Reading the mountain, I agreed. I'd been sitting close enough to him for most of the blizzard that our shoulders were in contact. I wasn't certain when that had happened. It had been incremental, the way two people find equilibrium in a cold space, degree by degree, until both of them have stopped managing the distance. You're always steady, he said. On the mountain, yes. Off the mountain, I paused. Considerably less organized. What does that look like? I own probably 60 books I haven't opened. I keep a climbing harness in my truck and I've canceled plans to use it approximately 40 times. I considered. I call my mother more than I want to admit. He smiled at the thermos. My equivalent. I have a very good apartment in Portland that I occupy for about 11 weeks per year. One functional pair of non-outdoor shoes. Met my neighbors twice. He paused. I like the apartment more if I have a reason to be there. I don't usually have a reason. You might soon. He turned to look at me fully then. Not surprised. Past the threshold of surprise. Something more settled than that. I reached out and brushed the snow off his jacket collar. Practical gesture. His collar was wet and the temperature was going to drop sharply once the front cleared, and that mattered for the next 30 minutes. That was why I did it. His hand came up and covered mine briefly before I pulled it back, warm through the glove. You have snow in your hair, he said. Constant, occupational hazard. I like it. Quiet. Certain, without any performance. It hit somewhere in my chest I hadn't been prepared for. I kissed him. Or he kissed me. Honestly, it was simultaneous. The particular kind of thing that happens between two people who have been moving in the same direction all day and finally arrived at the same coordinate. Brief, careful, cold lips, and the warmth that builds in close proximity at elevation, and it tasted like coffee and wind, and the specific relief of being alive somewhere beautiful with someone worth knowing. I can't remember the last time I held my heart in my hand like that. Perhaps it was the very first time. When we broke apart, we were both looking at the sky. "Windows open," he said. "Yeah," I said. "My radio. Nakano. This is flight. Weather window is clear. Spinning up for extract. ETA to your position 22 minutes. Copy. 2 personnel ready." I keyed off. "I need your contact information for the incident report." The corner of his mouth moved. "Piers Callahan, Jackson Hole Wildlife Film Festival Associate Fellow, AMK Ranch Research Station through mid-October. Odell Hayashi, Teton County SAR 4th Season, Jackson through November." "That's a lot of overlapping time," he said. "It really is." The Bell 429 came in south to north, below the ridgeline, the pilot reading the same corridor we'd established that morning. Skids kissed the shelf with complete confidence. Piers watched the approach angle and nodded slightly, confirming privately what he'd calculated hours earlier. Marcus Webb was already at St. John's Medical Center by noon. Tib-fib fracture, mild hypothermia, full recovery projected. He sent me a handwritten card in October. Yeva framed it and put it on the equipment room wall. The helicopter banked south. The Tetons below were white and sharp and enormous, the storm having left everything clean. Jackson Hole spread out in the late afternoon sun, gold on the flat valley floor. Piers had his camera out, shooting the post-storm light on the peaks. Still doing his job, even now. I was already thinking about what I was going to say when I called him tomorrow. He sent me the first cut of the Nutcracker sequence in late October. I watched it on my laptop at the SAR station, headphones on, between a shift briefing and a gear check. 12 minutes compressed from 90 hours of footage, the birds moving through the upper white bark pines at 9,300 feet, with the focused industry of creatures who understood that the future was a problem you solve today. His drone work was extraordinary. He'd gotten within 3 meters of active caching behavior without spooking a single bird. Near the end, one nutcracker stopped, turned, and looked directly at the lens. Held it for a full 3 seconds. Then turned back and continued caching. "The bird looked right at you," I texted. 15 seconds. Then, "They always know. They just decide whether you're worth stopping for." He came by the station that evening with the thermos. Refilled, same coffee, same formula. He sat across from me at the equipment table while I ran a carabiner inventory, and he worked on his edit on his laptop. And for 45 minutes, neither of us said anything at all, and it was the most settled I'd felt in any room in 4 years of doing this work. "The festival date is locked," he said eventually. "February, Jackson Lake Lodge." "I'll be here in February." He looked up from the screen. "Yeah?" "Extended my contract." I set down the carabiner. "Unrelated to you." "Of course," he said, completely unrelated. "Absolutely." He looked back at his screen. The corner of his mouth was doing the thing. I reached across the table and covered his hand with mine. He turned his palm up without looking away from the edit and laced his fingers through mine and kept working, and I thought, this is what it looks like when something fits properly, when all the components are dependent on each other in the right way. 6 months later, the white bark pines on the upper saddle were budding a full week early. Piers had 6 cameras on the research transect now, 3 drone stations and 3 ground units, documenting the phenological shift in real time. The cache had won Best Conservation Film at the Jackson Hole Wildlife Film Festival and been picked up for international distribution through a streaming partnership across 12 territories. He'd gotten the call on a Monday morning while we were making coffee in my kitchen. He'd stood very still, phone in both hands, for a long moment, then turned to look at me. 12 countries, he said. "Piers." "Yeah," careful voice. "Yeah." I crossed the kitchen and held him the way you hold someone whose good news is too large to process alone. He held back, one hand in my hair, one arm around my shoulders, and we stood at 7:30 in the morning while the coffee finished and the international rights to his father's memory settled into something real and permanent. In the spring, we went back up to the research transect together. I carried the equipment case, he set the cameras. The nutcrackers were active at 9,400 feet now, 200 feet higher than the 10-year average, 400 higher than the 20-year baseline. The forest was moving, slowly, generation by generation, seed by uncovered seed, but moving. We sat on the granite bench at Research Point Bravo, the Tetons behind us, the valley below. The same mountain where I'd found a man lying flat in a snowfield, watching his screen like it was the only thing that mattered. Because at that moment, I had something in my jacket pocket that had been there for 3 weeks. I'd been waiting for the right moment, and then I'd understood that with Piers Callahan there was no single right moment. There were only moments that were real, and this one was as real as they came. I want to show you something, I said. I put the small box on the granite between us. He looked at it, then at me. His face went very still. Odell, he said. We're both people who move fast when something is right, I said. I know that's not everyone's pace. I looked at the box. But you told me that the nutcrackers who survive the cascade are the ones who cash more than they need, the ones who commit beyond the minimum, who plan for the version of the future where things go hard. I paused. I'm not planning for loss. I'm cashing more than enough. He reached out and picked up the box, opened it. 2 titanium bands, narrow, matte, the kind that work at elevation and in the field and in everyday life without asking for special handling. You used my ecology metaphor to propose to me, he said. You gave it to me. I just knew what to do with it. He laughed. The real one, the surprised one, the one I'd been collecting for 6 months like a birder marking a rare sighting. He held the box in both hands and looked at it, and at the mountains, and at me, and his green eyes were brighter than I'd ever seen them, less contained. Something that had been held carefully for a long time finally letting itself rest. Yes, he said. Odell. Yes. I kissed him at 9,200 feet on a granite bench while the nutcrackers worked in the pines below us and the Tetons caught the morning light, and the mountain held us the way it holds everything it has decided is worth keeping. If you enjoyed the story and would like to support my channel so that I can keep bringing you more content, please don't forget to subscribe and give this video a thumbs up. I am looking forward to your support to help me reach 1,000 subscribers. You can also check out the membership perks and even become the hero of your own story. Thank you in advance for your support. See you next time.